A man is walking down a muddy road in the year 1350, somewhere between London and Canterbury. He has no idea if he'll eat tonight. He has no idea if he'll sleep safely. And he has no idea that 800 years from now, someone will still be trying to survive on the exact same food he's carrying in his pack. Because medieval travel wasn't romantic. It was a gamble you paid for in blood, coin, and sometimes your own stomach. There were potholes deep enough to drown a grown man. There were innkeepers who didn't just serve you dinner. Some of them served travelers a powder that stole their consciousness, right along with their silver. And yet, millions of people still hit the road. Merchants, messengers, knights, monks, and pilgrims walking towards Santiago de Compostela, or even Jerusalem, the final boss of medieval devotion. Every single one of them carried the same forgotten secret. What you packed in your bag could decide whether you made it home. Buried in a 14th century English manuscript is the answer. A candy engineered to survive weeks on the road without spoiling. Small enough to hide in your pocket. Tough enough to survive a journey that could kill you. Honey, sugar, pine nuts, and ginger, boiled down into something between a snap and a chew. Today we're walking that road, the safe stretches, and the ones nobody should have crossed alone, to find out what pilgrims, merchants, and monks actually ate between cities that could be weeks apart. And by the end, we're recreating this 700-year-old survival candy, exactly as it was made. Stick around, because this road does not end well for everyone. Before we hit the road, here's exactly what we're covering today on Savoring History. We're breaking down how people actually got around in the Middle Ages, on foot, on horseback, or by boat. And why, shockingly, walking was often faster than riding a horse. We're going inside medieval inns, from the cheap and sketchy to the ones run by monasteries that gave pilgrims free bread, wine, and even a parting coin. We're looking at actual medieval travel guides that told you which rivers were safe to drink from and which taverns you should avoid. Yes, that existed 8 centuries before Yelp. And of course, we're recreating this 14th century pine nut candy from scratch, step by step, so you can taste a piece of a road that doesn't exist anymore. If you're into history, you can actually taste. This channel is exactly where you need to be. And the easiest way to never miss a trip back in time is to hit subscribe right now. Legislate genuinely helps push this video to more history lovers who'd enjoy it just as much as you do. And I want to know, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your country and city in the comments. I love seeing how far this community stretches, and I try to reply to as many as I can. Now let's find out why packing a bag in the Middle Ages was a lot more dangerous than it looks. The idea that medieval people rarely left their village is a myth. Merchants moved goods between towns constantly. Messengers crossed entire kingdoms on foot and horseback, carrying letters that could start or stop a war. Monks, priests, and friars traveled for religious duties. Knights and mercenaries marched off to campaigns. Diplomats crossed borders to keep fragile peace treaties alive. And enormous numbers of ordinary people from every social class went on pilgrimage, sometimes purely out of devotion, sometimes as the closest thing the medieval world had to a vacation. But no matter your reason for traveling, the first real question you had to answer was brutally practical. How am I actually getting there? And whichever answer you picked, it was going to cost you. In time, in money, or in risk to your own life. Boats were the fastest option on paper, especially crossing open water or navigable river. But plenty of journeys required crossing solid land, and that's where things got complicated. Horses seemed like the obvious upgrade. A rider could cover 30 or 40 miles in a single day. But here's the catch nobody tells you. A horse wasn't transportation. It was a liability with legs. You had to feed it, stable it, and protect it from theft every single night. One surviving document from 1331 shows a group of 7 travelers, 3 merchants and 4 servants, paying 10 pence just to feed their horses for a single night. That's almost as much as they spent feeding themselves that same night. A tradesman at the time earned around 2 pence a day. That means one night of horse fodder could wipe out nearly a week's wages. And even after all that expense, a horse still might not save you any time. If you were traveling in a group with people on foot, or your horse was buried under cargo, you moved exactly as fast as your slowest companion, which could mean not moving fast at all. In 1297, Margaret, Duchess of Brabant, moved her entire wardrobe from London toward her new home in the Netherlands using a cart pulled by 5 horses. It took her 18 days just to cover the first stretch of the journey. From London to Ipswich. 85 miles, 18 days, less than 5 miles a day, 5 horses, and a snail's pace. So, unless you're hauling a duchess's closet across a continent, walking was often the smarter bet. Records show most travelers on foot covered around 15 miles a day, with the truly determined pushing 30, roughly 3 miles an hour, 10 hours straight, day after day. But speed was only half the equation. The real danger wasn't how fast you moved. It was what was waiting on the road while you moved. Most medieval roads were not maintained, and that neglect could be lethal. Some potholes were reportedly deep enough that travelers actually drowned in them. Which sounds almost too dark to be true. Except England passed an actual law banning people from digging wells in the middle of roads, because travelers kept mistaking them for puddles and falling straight in. Some roads, though, were genuinely well kept, usually the ones connecting major towns and cities, or old Roman roads still in use, like Icknield Way, Fosse Way, and Watling Street in England. But the roads you really wanted were the king's roads. The king needed to move quickly and safely, so these routes got special treatment. In 1285, King Edward I issued a decree ordering that roads between market towns be widened, so there would be no ditch, undergrowth, or bush within 200 feet on either side, where a robber could hide. An area wider than a football field, cleared on both sides, just so bandits had nowhere left to lurk. Old oak trees were the only exception allowed to remain standing, which tells you everything about how real that threat was. You don't clear a strip of land the width of a football field on both sides of every major road unless people are actually getting robbed, or worse, in the bushes beside it. So where did you actually sleep, if the road itself wasn't safe to stop on? Camping by the roadside wasn't really something people did. Travelers stayed with friends in a farmer's barn, or, if they were lucky, at an inn or a monastery. Inns ranged wildly, from cheap and rough to genuinely luxurious, essentially the hotel industry of the Middle Ages. Most included a hot meal, sometimes something as simple as a bowl of perpetual stew. A pot that never fully emptied, just kept getting topped up with new ingredients, sometimes for years at a time. Other inns delivered a genuinely impressive dining experience. A merchant named John de Villiers, traveling through England in the 1330s, recorded a supper in Nottingham featuring eel and flounder served with garlic and onions, plus fresh fruit. He was so impressed by the local ingredients that he spent 18 pence stocking up on almonds, sugar, ginger, and rice, 3 of which happened to be exactly what you need to make the recipe we're about to bring back to life. But not every inn was that trustworthy, and that's where it gets genuinely dangerous. Traveling internationally came with a very real risk. The food and water could make you sick, exactly like it can today. So medieval travelers relied on guides, actual documents written to help you survive a journey through unfamiliar territory. One of the most detailed is the Codex Calixtinus, a 12th century text written for pilgrims heading to Santiago de Compostela. It mapped the entire route through France and Spain, listed which rivers were safe to drink from, and rated the inns and taverns along the way. Essentially, a medieval restaurant review, except written with far more personality than anything you'd read today. The author didn't hold back either. He warned pilgrims off specific fish in certain regions, claiming they'd make foreigners deathly ill, while praising other regions for their bread and wine, even while complaining about the locals themselves. And travel guides didn't just warn you about bad food, they warned you about bad people. A 1370 medical text by John Ardern, technically written to treat medical conditions, includes a recipe for a powder that could put a person into a deep, unwilling sleep. Ardern himself notes it could be slipped to a pilgrim at an inn, so they could be robbed while unconscious. A medieval knockout drug, hiding inside a medical manual, written down as casually as a recipe for bread. Which is exactly why staying somewhere trustworthy mattered so much. And nothing was more trustworthy than a monastery. Hospitality wasn't optional for medieval monasteries. It was written into their code of conduct. Guests were to be welcomed the way you would welcome a stranger who might, according to their belief, be Christ himself in disguise. Some monasteries became pilgrimage destinations in their own right. The abbey at Cluny reportedly held an extraordinary collection of relics, including a fragment claimed to be from the true cross, and remains attributed to St. Peter and Paul. On arrival, pilgrims typically received a full pound of bread and a portion of wine. Stay a second night, and your portion was cut in half. A subtle, polite nudge to keep moving. And when you finally left, you were given a coin as a farewell gift, though only once a year, since monasteries kept track of repeat visitors. Compare that to a random roadside inn where someone might drug your food, and suddenly a monastery bed starts sounding like the safest place on earth. But if your pilgrimage destination was Jerusalem, at some point safety on land stopped mattering, because you had to board a ship, and medieval sea travel was nowhere near as comfortable as a monastery bed. In the 15th century, an English pilgrim named William Way documented his journey to Jerusalem, including a detailed packing list for anyone departing from Venice, the main departure point at the time. His list included preserved sweets, laxatives, ginger, rice, dried fruit, spices like pepper, saffron, and cloves, cooking equipment, wooden dishes, glass cups, and, somewhat unexpectedly, a cage of live chickens with enough millet seed to keep them fed for the entire voyage. Wine was essential too. Way recommended 3 10-gallon barrels, 2 for wine, 1 for water, and specifically advised keeping red wine in reserve for the return trip, believing it helped treat dysentery, a very real risk of long-distance travel at the time. Another pilgrim, Friar Felix Fabry, gave nearly identical advice. Bring your own wine, smoked meat, cheese, rice, almonds, dried fruit, and above all, large amounts of ship's biscuit, essentially medieval hardtack, and something so essential it practically functioned as currency on board. Which brings us back to something smaller, sweeter, and a lot more practical for an overland journey than a cage of chickens. Our 14th century pine nut candy. Time to actually make it. This recipe survives in an English cookbook compiled around 1390, and it calls for honey and sugar, boiled together carefully over low heat, watching it closely so it never burns. Once it reaches the right consistency, you stir in pine nuts and powdered ginger, pour it out to cool, and cut it into strips before it hardens completely. Here's what you'll need. 2/3 of a cup, or 200 grams, of honey. 1 cup, or 200 grams, of white sugar. And the recipe is specific about this being sugar refined near Cyprus, which at the time was one of the only places in the West producing sugar close to the white, refined sugar we use today. 1.5 cups, or 200 grams, of pine nuts, and 1.5 teaspoons of powdered ginger. Start by toasting the pine nuts in a dry pan for a couple of minutes. You don't have to, but it brings out a deeper flavor. Just don't let them burn. Split the pine nuts in half toasted whole, half ground into smaller pieces, since the original text isn't clear on which method it intended. And different historical versions of this candy go both ways. Add the sugar and honey to a saucepan over medium-low heat. Don't rush this step. Sugar burns fast, and it burns unforgivingly. As it heats, the sugar will dissolve into the honey. Give it one stir to combine, then leave it alone and let it climb in temperature undisturbed. The original recipe describes testing doneness by dropping a bit of the mixture into water with your finger to see if it holds together. Do not do this. Molten sugar will burn you instantly. Use a spoon to drop a small amount into cold water instead and judge the texture that way. For a softer, chewier candy, pull it around 270 to 290 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 132 to 143 Celsius. The soft crack stage. For something closer to a brittle, push it further to 300 to 310 Fahrenheit, roughly 150 Celsius, the hard crack stage. Once it hits your target temperature, remove it from the heat immediately. Stir in your ground pine nuts first, then the ginger, mixing until it's fully incorporated, then fold in the whole toasted pine nuts last. Pour the mixture onto parchment paper or foil, guiding it into a rough rectangle since it'll be cut into strips. Let it cool for just a few minutes, not fully, or it becomes too hard to cut cleanly. Then slice it into strips while it's still workable. And there it is, a 700-year-old road food, sitting right in front of us. Sticky, fragrant, and built to survive a journey that could take weeks. The honey and sugar together give this a much deeper flavor than plain sugar candy ever could. Pine nut is the first thing you taste, and the ginger doesn't show up until the very end. A soft, warm finish rather than an aggressive bite. The texture sits somewhere between crunchy and chewy, which means wrapping each piece individually is a good idea, because they will stick to everything, including each other. This is exactly the kind of thing a merchant, a pilgrim, or a messenger could have carried for weeks without it spoiling. Small, dense, endlessly durable, and, honestly, delicious enough that you wouldn't need 8 centuries of desperation to want to eat it. So think back to that man on the road outside Canterbury, back in 1350. He didn't know if he'd eat tonight. He didn't know if the inn ahead was safe, or if the road had a pothole deep enough to swallow him whole. But there's a good chance he had something exactly like this, sitting in his pack. Something small enough to carry, sweet enough to matter, and strong enough to get him one more day closer to wherever he was going. That's the real story of medieval travel. Not the danger, not the distance. It's the fact that people found a way to carry a piece of comfort with them anyway. If you made it this far, you already know what to do. Subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I'll see you on the next road, right here on Savoring History.